It's my great pleasure to introduce today's talk, and this is on behalf of the Multilateral Institutions Cluster. So I'll thank Joanne Weston, of course, for the facilitation, my co-convener, Alistair Edgar, in terms of hosting these various talks, and of course, Eric Tanguay, the research support officer that we are very indebted to for, again, facilitation and for efficiency. This is a talk we've looked forward to because, of course, there's a lot of traits about our presenter today, Colin Bradford, that we can kind of embellish. One, of course, and this comes back to his title today, is the fundamental one of whether global governance is on the rocks. I'm very pleased that it's got a question mark because one of the traits I'll talk about is Colin's optimism about reform processes in terms of global governance. Another trait, of course, that he's been everywhere, done everything, seen everybody. And here we can sort of look through his CV, development economist. He's been a political appointee, worked at the OECD, huge amount of Latin American experience, and since the last several years has been engaged in the Vision 20, co-chair of the Vision 20 initiative. And the third trait is that Colin anticipates in very many ways what's going to be happening, what's going to be important for the world of global governance. And this is how I met Colin. I went to a talk by a previous Prime Minister, Paul Martin, in Washington. I was working loosely with him on initiatives on global governance, April 2004, long time ago. And just before I left, I realized that Colin had written a paper on reform of the G7, G8. So kind of a cold call, knocked on literally the Brookings office door. Colin was there. We've chatted and we've been friends and colleagues ever since. So once more, we can see that we go back a long way. Colin has done important work. He continues to do it through the global financial crisis in 2008, and he continues now into a very different era. So on that basis, I'll turn it over to Colin, and 10, 20 minutes in terms of the opening salvo. I'll come in with a number of questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for the conversation. Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. And I can think of very few colleagues in this global governance history that we've shared together who's as effervescent and energetic and engaged as you are. And it's been a great pleasure to have worked and had some fun together as well over these many years since we started around 2004, precisely at that pivotal moment when Paul Martin announced at the Woodrow Wilson Center that he thought the G20, the G7, G8 should transit to a G20 at leaders level, which is the very same thing that I had said in the policy brief with Johannes Lind that very spring just before that point. I didn't know Paul Martin at the time, but he is indeed the father of much of what we'll discuss today. So I thought what I would do is to say, where are we in global governance today, since the title is a provocative one. And I think a few days ago, I might have had a little less to say about this than I do, or a little less optimistically to say about this than I do today. Because the first thing, of course, it congealed really yesterday in a very much more tangible form with the appointment of the national security team by Joe Biden, is to realize how fundamental really his election is to the future of global governance and to much else. I mean, this last 4 years has really been, for I think any serious person, a terribly scary moment in world history and American history, where we came and still are sort of teetering on a cliff that we should have never gotten close to. And it challenged the terrible thing for, I think, for those of us in this much narrower field of global governance is that nobody could have been more the opposite of what we all aspired, hoped would happen than Donald J. Trump and what he's tried to do to basically to destroy the very fundamentals of global governance that we were trying to work on, which is to generate more mutual trust, more engagement, and more sense of responsibility for global outcomes among governments who were taking until then a much narrower view of things. But it also, some of the disaster of the moment actually turns out, I think now in the wake of Joe Biden's presidency, winning the presidency, makes some of the very terrifying things that have happened into opportunities. I mean, think about how inadequate the G20 was in Riyadh over this last weekend. I mean, you had essentially Trump, when it came to talk about climate change, talking about land conservation. And he had always talked about whenever the climate change thing came up, he always would talk about clean air and clean water, which is not exactly what climate change means. The whole his narrative on COVID-19, I don't need to repeat for you, but in essence, the Riyadh summit, as I had suspected all along, was not able to move the needle in the way that one would have hoped would have been possible on global coordination. As a son-in-law of mine had said, boy, this COVID crisis, certainly if there can't be global coordination now, there can never be. Well, there hasn't been global coordination yet. So, but with Biden's selection, I think that's going to all change. And, you know, when you stop to think about it, there's not been much attention to this. But the fact of the matter is, Andy, in the 45-year history of the G7, G8, G5, G7, G8, there has never been a skipped year. And this year, the G7 will not meet in 2020, and it's under the US watch. And it's basically because people didn't want to meet with Trump. And Trump didn't want to meet with them either. I mean, he went to play golf, of all things, in the middle of a G20 summit, you know, on a crisis that affects hundreds of millions of people around the world. So I think these do present, it seems to me, I mean, what this particular piece of it, the G7 piece, means that for sure, when you stop to think of it, that the Biden administration, I think, given their proclivities, will hold on to the G7 and say, we want to hold one in 2021. So this gives an opportunity for the obvious pivots, which you all know about, that the Biden administration will go back into the Paris Agreement, will rejoin the WHO and try to resuscitate it, will strengthen NATO and the transatlantic relationship generally, I think, and even try to reboot the Iran nuclear deal. So this is a primary moment for a pivot, and I think we're very lucky in the G20 stream that the calendar happens to produce Italy as the host of the G20 Summit for 2021. And that's fortunate because what I've learned about Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister of Italy, is that he is a very progressive guy. He's also he's a professor of law, for one thing. And second of all, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine and friend of mine, who's a political scientist, Joe LaPalambara, and he wrote a book called about partitocrazia in Italy as being the big problem. And the problem was, as you see in Peru today, in fact, is the fact that there was a sort of an excess of party behavior, which actually became negative and destructive. And this guy, Giuseppe Conte, doesn't belong to any political party at all. And and yet he managed to form a center-right coalition in the first time he was prime minister. He stepped down or was forced down for a few months and is back now with a center-left coalition. I mean, all of this, it seems to me, speaks. He's supported China on the Belt and Road, which annoyed some of his European and certainly the US colleagues. But on the other hand, he's eager to engage with China. So it looks like Conte is a perfect guy to step into the breach for Italy Italy's been sort of in the backwashers in the post-Berlusconi period. Berlusconi was good at making press, but not making policy. It seems to me that it's a moment in which Italy can step forward and do itself a lot of good in the international arena by exercising strong leadership and bringing the G20 together again, strengthening multilateralism, and especially strengthening coordination around this crisis and the aftermath. So there are new dynamics at play and new dilemmas. And I thought that's what I would focus on and try to sort of raise for you what I think now are the tension points as we look forward. What are the things that need to get adjudicated? How can we frame this differently so that the current set of circumstances get transcended and we move into a new era? And not least, one thing that Andy didn't mention is good friends of his, two Canadian friends of mine as well, Alan Alexandrov and Eve Tebergen and I, who are the Vision 20 co-chairs, have launched a China-West dialogue. And the reason we did that was because there seems to be an inexorable move and even a consensus in many capitals that the West relations with China, especially the US relationship with China, is destined to become to create a bipolar competitive era going forward, which we think is not necessarily the path that not only shouldn't be taken, but doesn't have to be taken. So I think that's a backdrop for this that I want to emphasize as I give you a half dozen or so dilemmas and dynamics that could drive things going forward in the global governance channel. So the first one is the issue of values versus pragmatism. So there is still circulating, and the Biden people themselves, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Biden himself, have written about getting an alliance for democracies going. So there has been an effort, and this has always lurked in the background. At the time we were pushing forward on the G20, one of the most stimulating debates I ever had was within Brookings with a group of people who were in favor of a league of democracies. And Johannes Lynn and I were in that seminar with Strobe Talbot, the president of Brookings, and Ivo Dodler, who's now at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, who is the principal advocate for the League of Democracies, a terrifically wonderful guy, Ivo is and was. But unfortunately, we had to disagree about that. And I think that's something that who is in and who is out, it seems to me, in the global governance circles really depends on who's important and who's not for a given set of issues. It really shouldn't be driven by, there shouldn't be gatekeeping. If you're not a democracy, you can't step in the door. You don't have a seat at the table. I think that's just a mistake. Paul Martin very much feels the same way. He was very concerned that the G20 actually work. And his mantra is that it's a group of influentials and that you have to deal with them because they are the major economies and societies in the world and the major cultures in the world, if you like. I mean, you just cannot, in my judgment, you just cannot think of the future and leave China out of your thinking. The big deal is to integrate China into your thinking and into the discussion, into the conversations in an integral way, so that we're making progress on them, because there's absolutely not an issue you can touch in which China doesn't have a role. So the second issue is the degree to which that the underlying crisis, I think, that Brexit and Trump brought forward was really the capacity of governments to deliver social outcomes which are politically sustainable. And so a Chilean friend of mine calls this governability. Governability is the capacity. It's a terrible word. It's much governabilidad is much more elegant in Spanish than it is in English. Governability is the capacity to deliver. And Sergio's point was that we need stronger national governability to deliver social outcomes. So as the pillars for global governability, in the sense of global governance resting on attitudes towards global cooperation, which can't be there if you have a populist nationalist response, because social outcomes from the market and from democratic governments are inadequate. So there's a huge tension there. And as Alan and I were discussing this morning, I mean, it creates a very interesting tension from an academic, which is very interesting from an academic point of view, but believe me, it's even more interesting from a practical political point of view, which is the tension between experts on international relations and the global order and national security. Biden just appointed his national security team, on who have been in the past and still are today. The predominant experts are those people who are experts in security, military issues, and international relations, foreign policy experts. And what we're realizing is the global agenda pluralizes to issues like technology, digital governance, finance, economics, labor issues, is that there is a kind of, and the social drama becomes the centerpiece of where governments really have to deliver. We don't have legitimacy for markets and governance, whether Chinese governance or American governance. And is that there needs to be a blend of what we're calling a political economy approach, which is a broader set of expertise, a broader set of, anthropologists, sociologists, health experts need to be involved in these global conversations, not just military, and the other, not military people, but the other thing that military security experts and analysts or government officials. So there's a broadening of the agenda, which requires a broadening of the voices that are brought to the table to deal with it beyond the military security groupings. And this is reflected also in the fact that the G20 has been excessively, I think, dominated, as we've talked for years, and why the B20 came into existence, in fact, by economics, and within economics, finance. It is just not the case that the really primordial, even though there's a big debt overhang issue that's sitting out there, and we all know what to do about that, and there's absolutely no reason why the ministers of finance can't deal with it, as they are, with a new SDR creation, as coordinating finance. All this can be done by finance ministers. There's no one would tell you more clearly than Paul Martin, who was finance minister and was the father of the G20 finance ministers. The point we've made, Alan, Eve, and I, and Nancy Alexander, who was involved in this early on, in the B20 early on, has been that the leaders should focus on strategic issues that are of long-run consequence to their societies, and not worry about exchange rates, monetary and fiscal policy. That's not the jargon, and that's not a way to connect with the public angst. And it doesn't make for good G20 summitry, I don't think. And I'm sure if there's ever a moment where G20 leaders needed to relate to their people, it's now. So the capacity to deliver is the second tension after values and essentially gatekeeping, values versus pragmatism. The third is what we're calling plurilateralism. And this I would have you think about in the few minutes that I have left here. I don't want to run on because I do want to interact with all of you about these issues. Certainly the China-US relationship illustrates the degree to which a bilateral relationship between two powers, a G2 if you like, which I don't like the idea for reasons that will become clear in a minute, but that's what many people have talked about, is toxic, especially when you have both the Xi Jinping's regime tightening up its authoritarianism in the same period that Donald Trump is launching rhetorical barrages against the Chinese for the virus and for everything else that he can name. We need to move the bilateral thing just doesn't work, especially under these circumstances. And I don't think it's a question of Biden and Xi getting on and trying to figure out how to make the US-China relationship work. What we're doing in the China-West dialogue is precisely trying to transform that into a China-West dialogue, which would include other powers. And that's where plurilateralism comes in. And what the five powers that we're thinking of as being helpful, not in a G sense, not at leaders level necessarily, but more at the disaggregated level of the negotiating fora, for example, for financial stability on the one hand versus climate change on the other, global health on the one hand versus technology on the other, that you'd have different clusters of officials from different regions moving together to try to shape that agenda, and different countries would be prominent and others, and that would be what we call a shifting coalition of consensus. But for the purposes of trying to reshape the US-China relationship, we've thought about Europe, the European Union primarily, although Germany, France, and Italy certainly loom large in the European community to drive this forward. So it's Europe, the US, China, the three, a trilateral relationship, but that doesn't look too good to us either, because I think from the Chinese point of view, it looks like ganging up. And so it needs to have a little bit more complexity to provide more maneuvering room. And this is where Canada and Japan come in. And in the China-West dialogue that we've launched, we have Chinese involved directly with us and with many Europeans, Canadians, and Americans involved, and not many. I mean, it's a smaller group of 40 or so people when you total everybody up. But it's definitely a plurilateral group. And that the idea of that is that that the complexity can create both maneuvering room for countries, but also, excuse me, manageability. When you stop to think of it, a trilateral relationship has three players and two partners for each player, which is 6 channels of communications. A plurilateral relationship among 5 powers, 5 players with 4 partners each, is 20 channels of communication. Just to give you an idea, it's the number of players times the number of partners, which is n times n minus 1. That means that the G20 has 380 channels of communications. I mean, just think about it. That's not manageable, much less the UN. So in a certain sense, what I'm throwing out here for you to think about and us to discuss today is, obviously unilateralism doesn't work. That's what really Donald Trump engaged in. Boris Johnson kind of likes it too. And I think the UK is going to be left out of the global game because of it. And not just because of Brexit, but because of Boris. And so unilateralism doesn't work. Bilateralism is certainly, in the US-China case, doesn't work. And I think in many ways, multilateralism is something we need to restore at the level of the UN. We certainly need to keep strengthening the G20. The G20 is a kind of never land here between multilateralism and plurilateralism. Is you get to the point where you need to have something that's complex enough to provide maneuvering room, as I've said, in terms of the number of players, and yet is small enough to be manageable so that you can actually get stuff done. And I think the mantra that, again, that Paul Martin would bring to this, and that we've been trying to bring to it in the China-West dialogue, is let's get down to work. Let's not have this whole relationship in the global order, the entire international relations context, be driven by animosity and adversarial relationships because of ideological battles between a supposedly state-run economy on the one hand and a market-run economy on the other in the West, and between an authoritarian political regime, which, by the way, does incorporate a lot of diversity within it. It has horrible human rights record, okay. It's not democratic in the way we think of it, and I wouldn't try to justify it as an ideal regime type, but it isn't without its advantages. It does deliver social outcomes which are perceived by the Chinese people as being legitimate, and not only that, necessary. And so instead of having that kind of dichotomous tensions drive the new era, and it can, and it will, unless, I think, people in the foreign policy establishments in European and in Western capitals, including the United States, including the Biden team, realizing that calling for an alliance for democracies, strengthening, I think we should strengthen transatlantic relations. That's the mantra of the German Marshall Fund. But the German Marshall Fund also happens to put out a report recently called Strengthening the Transatlantic Alliance. if you're sitting in Beijing, you're not happy with that title on that report, I don't think. And so that makes me unhappy because I think it doesn't invite circumstances in which the Chinese feel as if they can come forward and be peers and be players in the global game in a way that is on an equal footing with the rest of the Western governments and other governments who are there as well. And so I don't think it's a matter of being nice. I think it's a matter of being realistic and understanding that we really need to think hard about how we construct what sort of negotiating force we have, what sort of dynamics, plurilateral, multilateral, bilateral, unilateral, what kind of dynamics do we put to play that can most generate successful outcomes. And so I've spent a good bit of time playing around with these different configurations of what different configurations would look like. And I do recommend to you that to think hard about whether plurilateral dynamics in negotiating for going forward are not much more conducive to achieving results than either smaller groups, trilateral group, or larger groups like going beyond the G20 to the UN and larger groups. So what unfortunately came to me, Andy, at the end of thinking about this in the last few days, is that as you play around with players, that is who should be in and who should be out in this new global plurilateral game going forward to try to guide the essential issues that need to be discussed, is one of the countries that really sometimes looks like it should be in the game and certainly is in the game in the China-West dialogue that we're doing, is Canada. And as someone who was actually became a professional during the period of Pierre Trudeau's prime ministership, in which Lester B. Pearson, former prime minister, had issued a international report on multilateralism, which inspired me no end. This was in the year 1970 when I had my first job in Washington. And the inspiration I felt all my professional life that Canada has been a strong middle power multilateral player. And one of the fears I have is that Canada has been able to be a middle power in a multilateral game. But if you begin to believe that plurilateralism, a more restricted number of players, helps drive the agenda forward, it's not clear to me unless Canada, and specifically Justin Trudeau at the moment, makes a decision that he wants Canada, unless Canada decides it wants to be a player and decides how it's going to play and enters the game in a more ambitious way, I can see Canada being left out of it. And nothing could pain me more, quite frankly. As you well know, I spent tons of time. Some of my good friends are Canadian, and I don't think that a lot of the achievement in global governance over the last decades would have been as good as it has been without Paul Martin for one person and Canada for another and CG for another, and many Canadians like yourself. So I just throw this out because a number of you must be Canadian at the Balsillie School, and it pains me to bring it up, but as I thought very hard about this in the last couple of days, I began to realize that a country that I most believe in as having a bigger than life role, bigger than its throw weight might suggest, may be left out of the game if you don't get more ambitious about what role you want to play. Thank you.
Wonderful, Colin. You've raised so many issues, but let's do a few in kind of the order that you've presented. One, leadership. I mean, our mutual friend, Alan Alexandrov, has coined the phrase, the iceberg theory, that there's Sherpas, there's finance officials, whole sort of spectacle of kind of advisors, technocrats around a leader. Yep. But from your remarks, you're kind of put the leaders in centrality, that even however Italy is managed, what it sees as global governance, if it has a technocrat in charge, they can do things. And going back to the 2008 crisis, I mean, leadership comes out in that sort of form, right? Gordon Brown, all sorts of different what's the intrinsic quality of leadership that you're looking for in terms of global governance? Is it the charisma of Pierre Trudeau, or is it the kind of technocratic quality of other leaders? Is there something in between, a kind of a meshed or a hybrid? What's the magic ingredient?
Great question, Andy. I think it relates to something else that you asked me about, which is how do you translate here? Let me just actually look at the how do you filter technical solutions to national publics? And I think that's, I mean, that's the reason why I came onto the V20 late, but Eve and Alan and Nancy Alexander had already formed it. But I had been saying for some years through the project we had at CG remember we were looking at public opinion and how the press portrayed summits in capitals to the publics. And that project revealed an astonishing lack of connectivity between leaders, G20 leaders at G20 summits back to their publics. It seemed to me that many of the leaders didn't make an effort to bring press people with them, didn't make an effort to think about in advance how they wanted to, what sort of storyline they wanted to develop about why they were there, and what the people of South Africa would get from it. I remember one year we looked at South Africa during a summit, which summit it was, and the only press that was really reporting to South Africans about what was going on at the summit and what their leader was doing there was the Associated Press, which of course wasn't reporting on their leader at all. So it seems to me that the leaders have not sort of, and I've urged the Italians already to have make sure their Sherpas dominate the leadership, the G20 process during their year, not the finance ministers. And that they do it on behalf of their leaders, and that they think carefully about how to orchestrate the development of a two-day summit in terms of what the storylines and messages they want to come out at each point along the way. And I think that leadership is the essence of it. And I think part of that is thinking through this relationship, being more strategic about thinking about how this looks to their publics and how you connect to the public for what you're doing there, and make something up, but don't talk to them about exchange rates, because 99% of the world does not understand exchange rates. And even economists will tell you that there isn't really a good theory of exchange rate determination, because there's so many forces at work that none of the theories really, explain and fully how exchange rates work. So what are we doing, as we did in Korea, as you remember, in Seoul, the G20 Summit in 2010, when a currency war broke out. And so the dominant storyline that came out of the Seoul Summit was the currency war, which of course, most publics, it impacts publics, but most publics don't understand. It's very complicated. So it's a ministry, it's a communication with financial markets in that case, rather than with people. And now we have a drama of the survival of the planet and the legitimacy of markets and governance to deliver social outcomes, people on the planet. And you don't want your summit to be talking about exchange rates or nuclear weapons or chemical warfare or things that are on the margins of what the public is worried about. So that takes a personality, it takes a communicator, but it also takes someone with vision who thinks about, okay, we're here on behalf of our societies. We're not here, this isn't a technical meeting, right? We can get the technical stuff done somewhere else. It needs to be done. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be done. That's what I'm arguing for, is disaggregating, getting things down below the leaders to tee things up, and then bring the climate change agreement back, then bring the digital governance thing back to the leaders. But get the job done. Trump is just not correct. I mean, he's a brilliant guy at playing the news cycle, but he doesn't understand anything about knowledge. He doesn't understand anything about policy, doesn't understand anything about governing in the way that we normally think about it. And so I think it does take a combination, and I think personality does matter. I think the capacity of someone to be able to talk naturally and connect with people really has something to do with what he or she thinks, but I think it also just has something to do with, you mentioned charisma. It doesn't necessarily have to be charismatic, but it has to be communicative. You have to be, I think Biden has revealed, thanks to Jim Clyburn, the senator, the congressman, House whip for the Democrats from South Carolina, revealed a crucial element in this moment for a leader to have, which is empathy. And I think, you've just got to be able to convey that. Otherwise, people are saying, what are you talking about? All this, all this fancy stuff. I mean, I want to know what's going to happen to my kids in school. I want to know what's going to happen to my city. I want to know what's going to happen to my health. I want to know what's going to happen to the infrastructure that's rotting in downtown Detroit. I want to know how our governments are healing the hurt and moving us towards sustainability.
On that point, in 2008, we didn't anticipate a kind of a populist response or counter reaction. We kind of valued technocratic skill. We valued knowledge. We valued kind of transnational coalitions of experts, of ministers, think tankers, and so on.
Right.
And even though we can highlight Trump and even Boris Johnson, I mean, populism is all over the place, right? I mean, Conte might go, the populists might come back in Italy.
Right.
We can define Prime Minister Modi as a populist in India who will take over the G20 in another year. I mean, it's all over the place. And again, I mean, Canada does seem in some regards to be an exception. But if we see populism as a challenge, coming back to communication skills, coming back to deliverables, how can we use institutions, even informal institutions, to counter that type of push?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, because how you can use institutions, if by institutions you mean norms, expectations, rules, laws, and institutions in the sense of bricks and mortar, that is to say, formal groupings that have their own dynamics and but are organized, that are not just ad hoc. Then I think the broader definition is easier to manage than the more formal one. Because I think there is a kind of institutional crisis. We've never been able in the G20 discussions we've had, despite the fact that there were a couple of, maybe still are, a couple of groups of parliamentarians that are involved in international and global governance. We've never been able, I've never seen a good systematic and continuous examples of relationships between leaders level summitry, for example, and parliaments. And in the end, virtually 80% of everything that would be discussed at the G20 Summit ultimately has to go through some form of parliament, whether that's the People's Congress in China, or which is not quite the same as other parliaments, but it's something of a parliamentary body. So there's that, and the parliaments tend to be fractious, and Peru's just got its third president in a week, who happens to be somebody some of us know from who used to be at the IDRC in Canada. Francisco Sagasti is now president of Peru. Why is that? Because the Congress is completely dysfunctional in Peru. So that's not a good one, and bureaucracies tend not to be good. And so I think one of the things we're finding, and maybe this is where you were pointing me in your question now that I think about it, is that I've found engagement groups now, some of which, not all of which by any means, informal groupings like the engagement groups on labor, youth, women, science, think tanks, etc., business, civil society that surround the G20 summits. I mean, I've begun to see that those groups have a leadership role themselves, which is not just to generate wisdom and ideas for the leaders, the official G20 leaders, but they themselves have leadership roles in their countries. And fortunately, in the German year, the think tank think the T20, Dennis Noer converted the T20 from the German year in 2017 to the Global Solution Summit in Berlin, which you and I have both gone to, and which has become a kind of permanent T20, if you like, and it's broader. It includes much wider range of people. It's not just think tank people. There's a lot of business leaders there, a lot of labor people, religious people, and so on. You know, the last time they met formally in 2019, there were 1,600 people in Berlin for the Global Solution Summit, and it was, you know, it was a huge success in the sense that I think the people, this was during the Trump period, during the Boris Johnson period. I mean, one of the things that happens in the T20 is it's much more progressive than the governments to which the countries, you know, are governed. So and even the business community now, if you read the literature and see what's happening, the business community is beginning to rethink the firm, beginning to rethink moving from a shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Those ideas are being, you know, brought up in these engagement groups, and to a very large, and this is more, it's a combination. It's not so much technocratic. I'm not so sure that that's the right term, because I think, to take an example of somebody who did a massively good job of running the G20 Summit, is Gordon Brown. But Gordon Brown was a technocrat, and Gordon Brown never really was very good at communicating with people, in my limited experience, individually nor collectively. And he never was elected prime minister. He was by the people. So he was a guy, if you remember, Jorge Dominguez had an idea about a technopole as a technocrat who becomes a politician. And Fernando Henrique Cardoso in Brazil, who was a great sociologist and academic, technocratic, if you like, became a wonderful politician, right? He became finance minister, foreign minister, then president of Brazil. That was a technopole. Gordon Brown never made that transition. So I'm not so sure it's about technocrats so much as it is, I think there's a real premium on people with political sensitivity who understand how things are heard and felt by ordinary people. And those leaders in business, in civil society, in religion, in, you know, this Michael Curry, who's bishop of the Episcopal Church, he's just an African-American guy who's just absolutely got the touch, right, to communicate with people. I think that this is where connectivity with people's concerns, I think, is where this all has to go.
Mm-hmm. The final question before I turn it over. We were both in Washington in 2008, the first G20. I remember going with Erica Leiner to the media center. I remember seeing you outside being interviewed, I think by CNN.
No,
I mean, overshadowing everything.
BBC. No, it was the other network in the UK. Actually.
Okay, a sense of crisis, right? You could not get away from the sense of crisis.
Right.
The media center was very sparse. I mean, it wasn't grandiose or extravagant. I mean, everything was about deliverables, about getting things done. You would have expected that during a COVID crisis, and we had done work on health even before the 2008, thinking that maybe pandemics would be the catalyst for a kind of reform, that leaders could understand pandemics. Even George W. Bush before 2008 could kind of understand what was going to happen or what should happen. Yeah. But the same sense of crisis doesn't seem to have galvanized the G20. I mean, Saudis have to take some of the aspects of this. I mean, the COVID crisis itself, in the sense that it's video and Zoom and everything else, but still, we don't seem to have the same sort of global crisis mentality that we had in 2008. Can you kind of embellish on that and explain or go beyond that type of analysis?
Well, this may be an individual point of view as an American who has. I realized last night when the dam finally broke on the transition for Biden and the new team, national security team, was named. I just felt a tremendous weight go off my back. I mean, I think that I'm not a big fan, and I know this is an issue that you're interested in, Andy, I'm not a big fan of American exceptionalism. I think we need to be a team player. more than think we were a light on a shining hill. I think the light on a shining hill gets us in trouble, and I don't think it's very believable after 4 years of what we've just gone through.
Mhm.
I'm not saying we shouldn't try to, state our values and make it clear that we care about human rights and we care about democracy and things like that. But in other words, I mean, we still have Angela Merkel, who's been the rock over the last dozen years in the global system. Now, she has been more limited in her reach. She's not a big player in Asia. And Germany is not. It has big investments and so on in Asia, but you don't think of Germany as really being. But she, to her credit, has taken the EU presidency, as you know, which is now this 6 months between July 1st and December 31st this year. And Chancellor Merkel is chairing the EU, and so she's doing an EU-China summit, and she's pushing hard to get a comprehensive investment agreement done, which is more than investment; it includes trade and technology. So, and SOEs for that matter, state-owned enterprises. So, Merkel is still there. She can come into play if she has some partners, right, to work with. And Macron, for all his, Macron seems to at times have the empathetic touch and then lose it and then gain it again and then lose it again. And I haven't followed him that carefully. You probably have, and I more carefully than I. But Macron can be a player too. I mean, he's very strong on climate change. He's strong on in a united Europe. He's a player. And I'm saying that Giuseppe Conte, who I have looked into and have talked to some Italian friends about, does seem to be potentially a player. Abe, unfortunately, is gone. I mean, he could have been a player also. And Suga, we'll see. And it's, I guess, people tell me that who comes after him is what's more important, and that's not clear in Japan. So Moon could be a player. Certainly Pierre Trudeau could be a player. Justin Trudeau could be a player if he were to decide to be. I mean, I think at times he really has been excellent, and at other times he too has faltered. And you have this terrible situation with the Canadians in jail in China, which I know inhibits what he's able to do on that front. And so I'm understanding of it in a way, but I think, I do going to be interested to see how any of you involved in this conversation today react to my statements about Canada's needing to be more ambitious. But in other words, I think I've always thought, Andy, as we've gone to these summits together over the years, or not gone to them, I've only been to one, which was Mexico, and the one in Washington. But as we've gone to the preps for those things, for those summits with host country governments and others, I've always sort of said, well, where's the play? When Obama walks in the room, who's he got to work with? Mm-hmm. Well, on some occasions there were 8 or 10, and in some occasions there's damn near no one. And it's been a little bit. I think the reason I think I hope my answer is not idiosyncratic to being an American liberal who's been painfully anxious over a 4-year period because of the destructive nature of Donald Trump. But I do think that the switch to Biden and Biden's team is going to be people that you can talk to. My God, I mean, who've been there, know where the light switches are and the keys and where the levers are, and they've been there, done that. They know what to do, and you can get some stuff going. And I just think it's a game changer. I think the Italians will be in touch themselves directly with the Biden people. I think that Biden would be, why not? I mean, why not jump on the Italian G20 year and make something of it and use it to drive global outcomes? So that it just looks like it, and Merkel's there until September, so you've got time, and you've got COP26 in early November. So it's the run up to that. She's still there, right, regardless of who comes later. And so you've got a player there to work with. And I think 4 or 5 or 6 countries, as I've suggested by the whole nature of the plurilateral argument that I'm putting out here for discussion, is enough to drive something. That's the beauty of it, is that other countries will fall, either say, I don't care, and so they don't get on the train. And some countries will say, oh, that seems good to me too. So you end up with 6 leaders and 4 to 5 or 6 more followers. And then those who oppose, the best thing you can do if you're only 2 or 3 out of 20 that oppose is just keep your mouth shut, because otherwise you look like, you're an outlier, which nobody wants to be. Certainly China doesn't want to be, which is an important thing to understand. So anyway, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Excellent, Colin. I will end my questions, but turn it over to Eric.
I'm conscious of time, so I wanted to give Andrew the last word. Do you have any concluding thoughts, Andrew?
Just to say again that Colin is a very unusual economist. I mean, if we were expecting a highly driven technocratic presentation, maybe we would be slightly disappointed, but I'm sure he can do this as well. It's just that for the topic today, it shows more the expansionist side of Dr. Bradford, and we're very indebted to that expansionist side. We can also appreciate the questions from the audience, because this also brings out that side, the Latin American side. We could have a question about the OECD that he would have been able to answer, the question about the succession of MDGs, SDGs, and so on. But it was probably at the heart of my interest, and I think a lot of the students, is the future of global governance itself, the institutional role, the summit process, and of course the issue areas. What does this mean? And I think in all of this, Colin has done us great value. I'm sure some of us will continue the conversation with him. I will certainly continue my friendship with Colin, and look forward to seeing him again. And thanks for participation. Thanks again to Joanne, to Eric for facilitation, and to be continued, but hopefully in a more optimistic spirit, given the circumstances. Whether the US is exceptional or not, Colin is exceptional. So again, thank you again. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk with all of you and to be part of this. Thank you, Andy, for making it possible.